Good morning and thank you so much. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here at the University of Ottawa. And I say that because I actually appreciate to be here for several different reasons. First of all, I really like academic institutions. And I have actually made one deliberate decision when it comes to my career, and that was to not become a politician, but instead to work as a researcher, partly at the University of Oslo and partly in the Central Bureau of Statistics in Norway. And I did that for 2 years, and I felt that I was on the right track for my life, working in academic life, teaching and scientific work. Then I was asked to become Deputy Minister for Environment back in 1990 in Norway, and I said I will do it for 1 year maximum. Since then I've been in politics, and I still have a longing for the academic life. So since I'm not an academic myself, I like to visit universities, to meet students, teachers, and to at least have some kind of feeling of what I could have done if I haven't, what should I say, I lost my life in politics. And now I think it's too late to go back to the academic life. So I will always be kind of only a visitor to universities. The second reason why I appreciate to be here is that this is the birthday of NATO, the 4th of April. So NATO was established 69 years ago today. And that's also the reason why I have these socks, which are NATO socks. I had to explain why I wear that kind of socks. So, yeah, from Canada. So that's the way so this is actually kind of birthday party for NATO, and you are all invited to take part in that celebration. A third reason why I like to be in Ottawa in Canada is that Norwegians, we have very strong and warm feelings for Canada. For many reasons, partly because of the weather. It reminds us of Norway. We feel at home here. And this is Norwegian summer. It gives us also, every time I go to Canada, it gives me an opportunity to remind people about the fact which many of you have forgotten. And that is that it was actually a Norwegian, Leif Eriksson, that discovered Canada 1,000 years ago. But he forgot, he left, and then he forgot to tell so many people about it. So he's not as famous as Columbus, but in Norway he is as famous as Columbus. So this is also my opportunity to remind you that it was actually a Norwegian that discovered Canada. He came from Iceland, so they are Icelandic. They say he was Icelandic, but we call him Norwegian. But then the last reason why I appreciate to be here is that I appreciate this opportunity to share with you some thoughts and some reflections on the challenges NATO is facing. Then I will do that, and after that I will be ready to answer your questions. So I will not cover all the topics, I will not give you all the answers in my introduction, but I will point at some main issues and some main topics, and then I will be happy to answer questions afterwards. NATO is the most successful alliance in history. And the main reason why NATO is the most successful military alliance in history is that NATO has been able to change, to adapt when the world is changing. And I guess that many of you knows the history. Many of you know the history of NATO, but just to briefly recap, NATO was founded in 1949, the 4th of April, and for 40 years NATO did actually only one thing. And that was to deliver deterrence against the Soviet Union. We did that mainly in Europe, and in the beginning we were only 12 members, the United States, Canada, and then 10 European countries. And we deterred the Soviet Union by being strong in Europe, with also Canadian and US presence in Europe. And we did that successfully. We prevented any conflict from erupting, and we helped to end the Cold War without one single shot being fired. And in '89, the Soviet Union was dissolved, and also the Warsaw Pact. And then in '89, '90, people started to ask, do we need NATO anymore? Because in one way we had fulfilled our main task, and that was to deter the Soviet Union against attacking any NATO ally. And then some people also said that NATO had to either go out of territory, meaning or out of area, meaning go out of Europe or the NATO allied countries in Europe, or NATO had to go out of business. And actually what happened then in the beginning of the 1990s, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, after the end of the Cold War, after the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact was dissolved, or were dissolved, we went out of area, meaning that we went into the Balkans for the first time. And because then I was actually a young politician in Norway, and I remember that was extremely controversial to just think about NATO moving out of NATO territory. So at that stage, we regarded to go to Bosnia-Herzegovina, to military operations over Serbia, Kosovo, as a very dramatic decision. But we made that decision, we changed, we adapted, and then NATO helped during the 1990s to end 2 wars in the Balkans, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Serbia, Kosovo. And later on, after the 9/11 attacks against the United States, NATO also became an important tool in the fight against terrorism. Our biggest military operation ever has been in Afghanistan as a direct response to a terrorist attack on the United States. And that's also the only time we have invoked our collective defense clause, Article 5, was after a response or after an attack on the United States. So then for approximately 40 years we did collective defense in Europe, and only that, 49 to 89. Then for approximately 25 years we did crisis management beyond our borders, in Balkans, in Afghanistan, fighting piracy off the Horn of Africa. And then the world changed again in 2014. That's another pivotal year in the history of NATO. Because what happened in 2014 was at least 2 things. First, we saw a more assertive Russia that used military force against the neighbor, illegally annexing Crimea, and started to destabilize eastern Ukraine. Second, we saw something very different, but also close to NATO borders. We saw Daesh, ISIL, growing from an organization that hardly anyone had heard about to an organization that controlled big parts of Syria and Iraq. They were actually able to threaten Baghdad. They took Mosul. They controlled territory as big as the United Kingdom, close to between 7–8 million people. That's on the border of NATO, on the border of Turkey. And then on top of that, we have seen proliferation of nuclear weapons, North Korea coming a bit later, and cyber attacks and so on. So since 2014, our security environment has fundamentally changed again. That's a bad thing, meaning that the world has become more dangerous. The good thing is that NATO has once again proven that we are able to adapt when the world changes. And NATO has responded to a more unpredictable, a more unstable world by implementing the biggest adaptation of our alliance since the end of the Cold War. We have responded in different ways, but let me briefly mention the most important elements of our adaptation since 2014. First, we have implemented the biggest reinforcement of our collective defense in a generation. We have more forces, more ready forces, and more prepared forces. We have tripled the size of what we call the NATO response force, and we have for the first time in our history deployed combat-ready troops to the eastern part of the alliance, with more presence in the Black Sea region, but especially with what we call enhanced forward presence, or 4 battle groups in Poland and the 3 Baltic countries. one of those battle groups are led by Canada. And I met the Canadian troops in Latvia in 2016. They are committed, they are professional, and I'm impressed by their dedication to serving so far away from their own country, contributing to our collective security, our collective defense, our shared security. And of course the importance of having Canadian troops in Latvia is partly that they are professional, well-trained, well-equipped, but partly also that they send a very strong signal of transatlantic unity by having Canadian troops in Latvia, US troops in Poland. It sends a very strong message that we are united. It is a really transatlantic alliance. NATO is present, multinationally present in the eastern part of the alliance. So anything that similar to what happened in Ukraine, in Crimea, in eastern Ukraine, cannot not happen to a Baltic state because NATO is there, providing the security guarantees, the strong deterrence, and if any Baltic country is attacked, then NATO will immediately be there because we already have deployed forces. So that's part of our adaptation to strengthen collective defense in Europe. We are also training our forces more, and we are addressing and stepping up our efforts to respond to, as I say, threats and challenges which don't know any borders, like, for instance, cyber threats. We are significantly building up our cyber capabilities, exercising more, sharing technology, sharing best practices, and of course some NATO allies have a lot of cyber capabilities, others are smaller and have less, but by working together we help each other, and NATO has a team with experts 24/7 ready to be deployed to different NATO allied countries to help them if they suffer cyber attacks. We have also decided that cyber attacks can be as serious as kinetic attacks, conventional attacks, meaning that the cyber attack can trigger Article 5. Because we see that, you know, the whole idea is that in the past it was easier to establish a clear line between peace and war. One of the challenges we face now is that it's much more blurred line between peace and war. Really, also not so many decades ago, the war started by one nation declaring war. An ambassador went up and gave a note to the other country and said, "We declare war," and then they start to fight on some battlefields. Well, and then normally the war ended with a peace conference or kind of deal. And I, coming from Norway, know that, for instance, in the Second World War in Norway, it started the 9th of April, and then it ended the 9th of April 1940, and it ended the 8th of May 1945. And we know exactly which countries that were involved in the Second World War. Norway was, Denmark was, but not Sweden. Now war is very different. Because, for instance, it's very hard to say exactly when did the war against ISIL start, or Daesh start. You cannot give a date. It's hard to say where did it take place. It took place in Syria and Iraq, and still takes place there. But it has also taken place in the streets of our own countries, with terrorist attacks organized by Daesh in our countries. It has taken place in many other countries, in the Middle East, North Africa, but even in Asia. We have Daesh, ISIL in Afghanistan. And it takes place in cyberspace. And I doubt whether we ever will be able to say that the war against Daesh or ISIL ended on a specific date. So one of the challenges we face is this blurred line between peace and war, and that the conflict takes place in so many more dimensions. Therefore, we have, when we are speaking about increasing our collective defense, that's partly about the conventional forces, deployment, and so on. but it's also about intelligence, doing more in the fight against cyber, hybrid tactics, higher readiness to be able to respond quickly if needed, and so on. So when we adapt NATO, it is about adapting NATO in many different dimensions. Part of that is also to step up our efforts to fight terrorism. And NATO has played a key role in the fight against terrorism for many years, especially since 9/11. Because that's still our biggest military operation, the operation in Afghanistan, as I just said. But I think that the lesson we have learned from Afghanistan, but also from Iraq and from other countries, is that yes, NATO and NATO allies have to be ready to deploy forces in big combat operations, as we, for instance, did in Afghanistan or in Bosnia-Herzegovina, taking part in big combat operations. But in the long run, it is better to train local forces than deploy our own forces in combat operations. Because we will always be foreigners in foreign countries. We will always be, they will always try to depict us as occupants and someone coming from the outside trying to solve their problems. So if we can help them solving their problems, help them to stabilize their countries and to fight terrorism themselves, then it's much better. So therefore, yes, we have to be ready to deploy forces in combat missions if needed, but it's more viable, more effective, and more sustainable if we can enable countries in the Middle East, in North Africa, in Afghanistan, to stabilize their own countries themselves. And that's exactly why we gradually are shifting our focus from combat operations to training missions, helping countries. That's what we do in Afghanistan now. We have ended the combat operations. NATO is not conducting combat operations in Afghanistan any longer. At the peak, we were more than 100,000 combat troops, NATO combat troops in Afghanistan. Canada was there. Now we are around 15,000, 16,000 NATO troops doing training, assist, advise the Afghan troops. I'm not saying that the situation in Afghanistan is easy, but I'm saying at least it is a big achievement that we have enabled the Afghan troops, the Afghan national security forces, to be responsible for security in their own country. We should do more of that. And that's also the reason why we are now in the process of establishing a training mission in Iraq, where we will scale up NATO's training of Iraqi forces, helping them to fight Daesh, to stabilize their own country. We're working with countries like Jordan, Tunisia, very different situation, but the same idea. Prevention is better than intervention. Training is better than combat if we can avoid combat. That's also part of the way we are adapting NATO. I mentioned cyber. Let me also add that we are also building up our missile defense systems. One thing is what you do in North America, and that's that, but also we have a NATO system in Europe. We have Aegis Aegis ships based in Rota in Spain, with missile, also they can intercept incoming missiles. We have a site in Romania, and we are building a new site in Poland, and we have some radars. So this is an advanced system of missile defense, which we are then gradually building out in Europe. To do all this, to increase the readiness of our forces, to have deployment of troops in the eastern part of the lines, to exercise more, to have better equipment, to scale up what we do in cyber, to fight terrorism, we need to spend more. And that's perhaps the strongest expression of that we are now investing more in our security, is that after years of decline and cuts in defense budgets across Europe and Canada, we now see an increase in defense spending again. European allies have started to increase. And Canada has really started to increase defense spending after years of decline. And I commend Canada for the strong increase we have seen in defense spending, which enables Canada to do more for our shared security, our collective defense, but also the strong commitment of Canada to continue to make further increases in defense spending. That's important, and Canada provides highly professional, high-quality capabilities to NATO, and we are extremely grateful for that Canada has turned the corner and after years of decline started to increase. Then let me just briefly add on that point that in one way it's bad news that we have to spend more on defense. And when I was Minister of Finance in Norway back in the 1990s, I was quite proud of cutting defense budget. I was an expert on that. I knew all the ways. And we reduced defense spending in Norway as in most other European countries and Canada. But the main argument I used in Norway as Minister of Finance back in 1990 was that, well, tensions are going down, the Cold War is over, we don't need it. So therefore we cut. But if you reduce defense spending when tensions are going down, you have to be able to increase defense spending when tensions are going up. And I think there is no way to say that we are not faced with a more unpredictable, unstable world now than we were, for instance, in the 1990s. So yes, I'm able to defend the fact that defense budgets in many NATO allies, Canada, Norway, many other countries, were they reduced in the 90s and actually also in the beginning of 2000. But then we have to increase now, and that's exactly what's happening. And we have had 3 consecutive years of increased defense spending across Canada and Europe since 2014. Also the first year of increase was in 2015. We made a decision at our summit in Wales in 2014 to stop the cuts, gradual increase, and move towards spending 2%. And that's exactly what NATO allies, including Canada, has started to do. The last thing I will say is that we have to remember when we now modernize NATO and when we invest more in defense, deploy troops, increase readiness, we have to remember that the purpose of strong defense, the purpose of credible deterrence, is not to provoke conflict. The purpose is to prevent conflict. So therefore NATO is a defensive alliance. We respond. Our aim is always to respond in a proportionate, measured, and defensive way. Therefore, we also convey a very clear message to Russia that, of course, we are concerned about what we see: a more assertive Russia, illegally annexing Crimea, destabilizing eastern Ukraine, supporting the Assad regime, being responsible for cyber attacks, meddling in domestic democratic processes, and in other ways responsible for actions which are undermining a rules-based international order. And that's also the reason why NATO allies and partners reacted the way they reacted after the attack in Salisbury. Because that's not a single event. It's an attack which has taken place on the backdrop of a pattern of behavior which we have seen over many years from Russia. And that's the reason why we had this unified response expelling diplomats from NATO allied countries and from NATO. But we continue to strive for a better relationship with Russia. Because Russia is our neighbor, Russia is there to stay. We are not aiming at isolating Russia. It will be beneficial for us and for them if we could improve the relationship between NATO allies and Russia, between NATO and Russia. So therefore we will continue to work for arms control, prevent a new Cold War, avoid a new arms race, and continue to work for a political dialogue with Russia, because NATO is a defensive alliance. Our aim is to preserve the peace We have done so for almost 70 years, and we will continue to do that by standing united and proven able to adapt and change when the world is changing.